Welcome into Weather and Your Business Google Hangout. This is where we go in deep, look at everything, including the weather and how it's going to impact your business, your wallet, your investments. This is unique information that we want to bring to you at the start of every month, and we have the best in the biz to give you all the goods. We're going to first start with Dr. Greg Postel. He is our hurricane specialist here at the Weather Channel. He's going to take a look at how September has panned out weather-wise and take a peek ahead. And of course, Paul Walsh, he is our business and weather expert. He's going to translate all of that into what businesses can expect going forward. So, Greg, we're going to start with you. How is September? How has it shaped up?
Well, September has been fairly warm across much of the country, and I think we're going to see a lot of that as we move through the rest of October. And if you look at the first week of October and the way it's been so far, temperature-wise across the country, you can see that our temperature anomaly map here shows that basically the eastern half of the country has been warmer than average, in some cases 6 to 10 degrees warmer than average, and the west has been cool. Now, as we move through, I think, the middle of the month, I think we're going to see the trend continue. Basically, this is persistence moving forward. There's really nothing in the general circulation that's going to change this pattern, I think, in the next 6 to 10 days and maybe even a little bit beyond that. So all the way through the middle of October, the east, places like New York, Atlanta, Chicago even, and Houston, probably warmer than average, and significantly so if you think about how long of a period we're averaging over, 2 to 6 degrees above in the east.
Right, and that is the next week or so.
Yeah.
You'll see the cooler than average there from Seattle, Los Angeles, affecting big markets there.
That's exactly right. And you can sort of fit the jet stream to that model, and you can get the sense that what we've seen really in the past week, and we expect through the middle of October, is this sort of seesaw where you have the ridge in the west and the trough in the east. The jet stream has brought some cooler conditions in the west with the dip there, and we've had that ridge in the east where the high pressure warm bubble of air aloft has been in place in the east. That's really what we expect through the middle of the month. And then, but here we are. Yes, there are some signs in the weather forecasts that things will change at least a little bit, that we'll start to see, instead of ridging in the east and troughing in the west, just the opposite, a little ridging in the west and some troughing in the east. Now, that would probably not really show up in earnest until I think the last week to 10 days of October.
Right.
So we do see signs changing, but because it's been so warm, when you include that factor in, and when you sum it up as a whole, this is our October forecast. Still, we hang on in October in the balance to the warm in the east, cooler in the west. But I do want to point out, as we head toward the end of the month, the risk to go cooler, I think, is in the east.
Right, and we're looking at October as a whole,
exactly.
So it's 1 through 31. So
that's right.
A lot of that heat has already been baked into the equation.
It's already in there. That's exactly right.
Yep.
Baked. I like that.
I like that too. I'm going to use that. All right. So how about the business part?
Well, why don't we take a look first at the next upcoming weekend, Columbus Day weekend, because that's really important from a business perspective.
Yeah, it is. And when you look at the temperature forecast from October, that is there. But there are some sort of weather events that are ongoing now that we think will play a role in the weekend, in particular in some of the very large markets in the east, New York, D.C., all the way down through the Carolinas. This is what it looks like now. There's a frontal zone along the East Coast, and that's not going to move very much through much of this week. So what you see there is pretty much what you're going to get. Clouds, cooler than average conditions just by a little bit, a couple degrees, but really kind of rainy indoor-like weather along the East Coast. And some of that does have some help from the tropics, that little L there that you see just south of Bermuda, maybe bringing some moisture back to the East Coast. So kind of, as I say, good shopping weather, I think.
Exactly. Interestingly, there is a silver lining to this whole sort of scenario that we're looking at for the Columbus Day weekend.
That's right.
Yeah, and just to sort of now transition back into what all this might mean for us from a consumer perspective, as well as what it might mean for businesses and large businesses. When we look at the fall season, the weather has a really significant impact on all of us as consumers, and that translates into business. Because the weather is, number one, the seasons are changing, and the weather can be very changeable. So you can go from a really warm week like we had last week to a relatively cool week that we're looking at for the next couple of days, for example, that feels cool, and that actually drives demand for seasonal product categories. Because we live in a land of plenty, you really don't have to wait to plan to buy the products that you need. So more and more, we buy products when we need them. And when you're looking at the seasonal time frame, especially now, when we're looking at the fact that we're in October, the weather is what drives that need. So if the need's not there, demand's not there, sales aren't there, and it translates into business. So when we talk about looking at the business and the impact potentially on businesses and also on your wallet when it comes to looking for sales and things like that, what you need to do really is you need to first look at what happened last year, because all businesses plan their business for the upcoming year based on the performance that they got last year. And because sales were impacted by weather last year, you have to look at the weather last year to get a sense for how things are likely to line up in the future. So first I want to look at the month of September. So last month, September 2012 was relatively cool and was also relatively wet. It was extremely wet, of course, for the last week of September, which is when Hurricane Sandy hits. We'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, it was a pretty good month. This month we actually were the September of this year, it was actually warm, as Greg noted, except for the Northeast, where I think it netted out to be a little bit cooler than normal. For the most part, it was a very, very warm period across the month. And so what that means is that demand for seasonal product categories was likely, on the whole, down from where it was the prior year, which means businesses that planned their business for this year based on last year may have had too much merchandise. That means that inventories may be high. That means for consumers, there actually may be some deals starting to form out there, because in order for retailers to move the product, if the weather doesn't cooperate, they only have one alternative, and that's to lower the price. So from a business perspective, a warm September is not good. From a consumer perspective, it ain't bad. It ain't bad, because there may be some deals out there. In fact, what we do here at the Weather Channel is we actually do polling on weather.com, and we ask people how the weather makes them feel and how the weather has sort of impacted their sales habits and also their consumption habits. And to put this into perspective, for the last week of September, last fiscal week of September, which actually was last week, what we found, to give you some perspective, is that demand for like lightweight clothing, leftover summer clothing, shorts, things like that, was actually up significantly from the prior year. But at the same time, demand for seasonal outerwear, things of that nature, down significantly from that year, from last year. And when you look at the forecast, if you sort of piggyback on what Greg just said in terms of what we expect for the next couple of weeks, that trend is likely to continue against the relatively cool weather last October. So this whole the scenario of merchandise sitting on the shelves, retailers forced to take deeper markdowns, means that there's probably going to be some pretty decent deals as we move through the next couple of weeks. Good for consumers, not so good for businesses. But there's a silver lining to all of that. This basically just when you look at October again, it was a relatively cool October versus in 12 of last year, and then we're expecting that this October, for the most part, is going to be warmer than normal. So overall, it's going to be much warmer than last year. Has started out much warmer than last year, and we're already measuring the impact of that in terms of consumer demand. The opportunity, though, as Greg noted, is that we do see this pattern change. And this pattern change will likely happen towards the end of the month in time for Halloween. The pattern change, when it follows a period that's abnormally warm, is going to be sort of stronger than normal. Because when you've got a period where the temperatures are warmer than normal, we all sort of get used to that.
You forgot about winter.
Exactly. So you end up having this sort of supercharged effect. And at some point, at some points of the year, we may see that again. We get a bit of in the spring we have cabin fever, but in the fall it's sort of the opposite of that. It's like, oh my gosh, I got to go out and buy my seasonal products and my soup and all of those kind of things that I haven't been buying because, again, we live in a land of plenty. We buy it when we need it, and we haven't needed it, at least for the eastern part of the country, for most of the year. So from a retail perspective, slow now, good for consumers, not so good for businesses. From a business perspective, if you're a small business and you're selling apparel, if you're a medium size, even if you're a large business, the thing to think about now is the fact that if you're advertising for product categories when the weather is not as conducive, it's not going to be as effective. But if you're advertising the last week of October, first week of November, when we expect the weather to start to turn cold across the large markets, that advertisement is going to be way more effective.
Kind of taking advantage of the panic mode that the consumer is going to be like, oh, okay, I remember now. It's fall and
right,
winter.
Exactly.
So even from a pricing perspective, again, if I'm a small business and I'm selling seasonal product categories, and my inventory is piling up, and I'm thinking to myself, I need to move this product. So do I mark it down 50%, or do I keep my powder dry? than hold off and wait for the weather to change. If you are able to hold off and wait for the weather to change, maybe now you don't have to take a 50 off. Maybe you can take a 30 off or a 20 off, and that's money in the bank if you're a retailer. If you're a consumer, you want to start buying your stuff now before it starts getting cold so that you can take advantage of the fact that large retailers are going to be having to mark down. From a consumer packaged goods perspective, when we talk about soups and stews and all those sort of comfort foods that people buy, which is really heavily impacted by weather in this time of year. In the fall, the correlation between sales of soups, for example, and weather is really high. And so the fact that it's been warm for the last few weeks in the big Northeast markets means that those kind of businesses have been suffering a bit. Their product has been moving. So we expect, just like with retail, that when the weather turns, those products will move fast. The only fine ointment now, and this isn't really weather related, it's more of a macroeconomic impact, is the fact that we're going through the government shutdown, and there's a threat of even more sort of damaging impact from this. I think that's having a negative impact on retail overall, but the weather influence remains. And so I do expect that we're going to see the slowdown, and then when the weather breaks, when Greg brings us that cold air,
I promise it's coming.
You heard it here first, guaranteed. The business will come back. So I think that there is definitely a silver lining for retailers, and that there's an opportunity for us as consumers to get out and buy early, ahead of the point when it gets cold.
And I'm just going to ask real quickly too, because the timing, you're talking, Halloween,
yes,
and then we have, of course, Black Friday. That's coming in at a good time where it's going to be really good for retailers.
It is, and I will just to point out that when we look forward, now it's really early, and we'll update this next month, but as we look into November and even beyond, that pattern change that Greg mentioned, at least the early signals are that will change, and so there are hints that we may see a pretty cold winter, which, as long as it doesn't snow on the weekend in the major markets, is really good for driving holiday sales. So we'll do a more in-depth holiday piece next week when we get a little bit closer.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I want to ask a question about the elephant in the room, or not in the room, and that's the lack of the tropical season. And Greg, I want to ask you, obviously that's a high business impact, because if there's no tropical storms to prepare for, people aren't running out and getting those kinds of supplies. So what do you think is the rest of the tropical seasons looking like?
I think it's going to be pretty quiet. I mean, we don't really see any signs right now that there's going to be activity, certainly anywhere close to North America. The places, as we move through October, November, the places that you look for development are actually close, like the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. But right now, certainly for the next week, things are going to be shut down pretty much. There may be some activity in the middle of the Atlantic, but there's no sign that any of that's going to come anywhere near us. So it's hard for me to see this trend, this prolonged trend that we've seen this season, taking an abrupt turn toward a more active phase. I just don't see it. It's not really in the data. I think it's going to remain overall fairly quiet.
So, Maria, that actually is for this year, it's a very positive sign for retail, obviously, because the impact of Sandy, while it was the East Coast, basically, but that population center is so large that it does impact the overall population of the U.S., and for several days, or at least 2 days ahead of the storm, everybody was distracted. So very few people were going to malls. A lot of people were going to the home centers and buying all the things that they needed, and grocery stores. So those kind of businesses actually saw a huge spike in sales that last week of the month before the storm hit, but then the following week everybody was shut down. From a retail perspective, November, so the benefit, if we can use the word benefit, or the surge in sales that happened last year happened during fiscal week October for the large grocery stores, the large home improvement centers, but for specialty apparel retailers, for example, and for malls, they lost a ton of business last year. So this year, when we anniversary that week, we would expect that there's going to be much higher sales for mall-based retailers, apparel retailers, which, by the way, will be helped significantly as we see the cold air come in for that following week. So there's a real benefit if we can keep those hurricanes away, and Greg will work on that.
I'll try my best.
Cold air, hurricanes, get to it.
Exactly. No hurricanes. We want it to be seasonally cold, and bring it on. Bring on the business.
Okay, so I guess to kind of sum it up, I mean, retailers are hearing this, may not get the weather to cooperate in some ways. What can retailers do now to kind of prepare for that?
Well, it's a great question, and I mentioned a little bit earlier as we were talking, but Generally, what retailers do, the way they manage the price of their products is by monitoring the inventory. So they know they've got a certain amount of time to sell their products, and they know they've got a certain amount of inventory. If they're not selling the product fast enough, the only levers they have is to really reduce the price. Right. Well, if they understand, as we've been talking, that while the weather is not cooperating now, and it may not be cooperating for the next week, next 10 days, but we do think it is going to turn, and it is going to get cold enough, the weather's going to come, and it's going to help them sell. So therefore, by watching the weather, even if you're a small business, understanding that things are going to turn around, you can plan your markdowns differently. You can run advertisements or wait to run advertisements to align with when the weather's going to really break. So you spend the money to run an ad a week or so, or maybe just a couple of days before it really turns cold, and you don't mark down as much as you would normally do. So you increase sales, and then you increase your profits if you're a business, whether it's small business or large business, it really doesn't matter. And in a lot of ways, small businesses can take more advantage of this because they have more flexibility. They're just running one store or 3 or 4 stores. Right. So that's an example of how you actually leverage weather data, and you use it to help you sell more at a higher price.
All right. That's, I think, music to retailers' ears.
It is.
Yeah. Something tells me.
Or it can be. Yes.
It can be. It can be. All right. I think that does it, right?
It does,
All
yes.
right. Paul Walsh, Dr. Greg Postel, thank you so much. Of course, we're going to keep watching the weather, waiting for the cool, and no hurricanes.
Right.
Hope you deliver.
I'm trying.
And the next update coming next up.
Right. And then just to point out, next month we'll start to take a deeper look at the really key holiday season.
All right. Looking forward to that, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
All right,
See you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.